The scripture this morning is from the book of Acts, chapter 2, verses 14 through 18, from the New Revised Standard Version. Peter, standing with the 11, raised his voice and addressed them, "Men of Judea and all who live in Jerusalem, let this be known to you, and listen to what I say. Indeed, these are not drunk, as you suppose, for it is only 9 o'clock in the morning. No, this was what was spoken through the prophet Joel. In the last days it will be, God declares, that I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. Even upon my slaves, both men and women, in those days I will pour out my spirit, and they shall prophesy." May the Lord add his blessing to this reading.
Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home, coming for to carry me home. I looked over Jordan. What did I see? Coming for to carry me home. A band of angels coming after me, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home.
Indeed. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you. For the longest time, I remember that my parents kept the autobiography I wrote when I was in the 6th grade. I think they were just as startled and amused as was my teacher when, in response to the question, "What is your dream for what you want to be and do when you grow up?" I wrote, "I want to drive a Greyhound bus so I can see the country." Now, nothing wrong with driving a Greyhound bus. It's important and honorable work, but I don't think that we had ever mentioned Greyhound buses in my home, and I don't recall ever having ridden one at that age. I suppose, though, that my parents could at least take some comfort in the fact that my answer had changed from the time that I was 3 years old, and it was reported that I once told an adult who asked me, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" that I wanted to be a fire truck. Not a firefighter, a fire truck. Now, while I may have achieved the girth of a fire truck, apparently I came to realize that being a fire truck is not a good career dream. In American English idiom, there are many phrases that refer to dreams, and when you begin to catalog them, you realize that as a culture, we seem to have some very mixed feelings about this whole notion of dreams. On the one hand, there are the disparaging and derogatory kinds of phrases like "in your dreams," or "that's a dream," or "dream on." But on the other side of the ledger, who hasn't been stirred to the depths when listening to Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech, with its stirring cadences that evoke the best of America? Or more prosaically, I suspect that many of you can recall the Mamas and the Papas song, "California Dreamin'," which beautifully expresses that haunting longing for some place in life that is warm and fulfilling on those occasions when life seems too much and too often like a cold winter's day. How many of you are humming it in your head right now? Or consider Professor Benjamin May's profound words when he says this, quote, "The tragedy in life doesn't lie in not reaching your goals. No, the tragedy lies in having no goals to reach. It isn't a calamity to die with your dreams unfulfilled. It is a calamity not to dream." It is a calamity not to dream. How true that looks in retrospect for that day of Pentecost almost 2,000 years ago, a day we celebrated last Sunday. The disciples in that story avoided the temptation to dream too small, and they avoided that inclination to say disparagingly, "in your dreams," and dismiss the stirrings and the movement of the Spirit. But they could have, They could have missed it. They could have missed everything that the Spirit was trying to give birth to. And there were some in that crowd on that day who did miss it. It's one of the more humorous lines, I think, in Luke's writings, where he writes that some in that crowd who had gathered there to hear Peter's preaching and be animated by the Holy Spirit were just drunk. But Peter responds, "Did you hear it? They're not drunk. It's only 9 a.m. Let me then talk a bit more about two specific mistakes that the disciples avoided on the day of Pentecost. The first is the mistake of ruling certain people out, of acting as if certain people don't really count or don't count as much. And the mistake of not blessing the future because their dreams were too tiny. Both mistakes that were avoided can be found at the end of Peter's sermon. Notice again what he says, those stirring lines. God declares that I will pour out my Spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. Even upon slaves, both men and women, I will pour out my Spirit. And with these words, which are, as we noted last week, actually a quotation of the prophet Joel, Peter reaches back in order to point forward. He claims these words as the founding words to guide the church in its life and its mission, and thereby says no to the mistake that the culture would try to impose on the church if it could. What do I mean? Well, in first century Judea, occupied by the Roman army, a colony of far-off imperial Rome, it was only Roman citizens who had any standing, as it was called, any standing to be counted in a court of law or in almost any other official transaction. And even then, for the most part, it was male property-owning citizens who had standing in the eyes of society and the law and the government. Women didn't count. Children didn't count. The poor didn't count. Slaves certainly didn't count. Rural folks didn't count as much as urban folks. And folks who could speak Greek counted more than those lowly Palestinian peasants who only spoke Aramaic. Have you ever had that experience of feeling like you don't count? For me, one of those still painful memories from middle school has to do with PE class as it was conducted back in that Jurassic era, when the coaches would pick two captains and then those two boys would start picking up folks for their side for whatever game was going to be played. The jocks and the physically coordinated were always picked first, right? But the nerds among us were not. Middle school memories can last a lifetime, can't they? And I can still recall that increasingly awful feeling of standing there in the shrinking circle of the unpicked, feeling more and more like I didn't count, wasn't wanted, didn't matter. It's the feeling that, rightly or wrongly, also seems to be driving so much of this election season and is unfortunately manifesting itself on every side as increasing hatefulness. But that first Pentecost showed a different story, a different reality, a different hope for how the world could be. For in the newly born church, everyone counted. No one stood in the circle of the unpicked. Peter's words are a testimony to the fact that God can and will use everyone. Peter's words are an affirmation of the fact that God has always sought to employ the talents of everyone. And Peter's words are a reminder that the ability to dream well is a gift from God that is not limited by race or gender or age or orientation or status or anything that the world so often values in making decisions about who counts. And so, that's the first mistake avoided, the mistake of thinking and acting as if some people count more than others in the eyes of God, for that would have turned the church into just one more club. The story of Pentecost is the story of the fact that from God's point of view, everyone counts, everyone is called on to contribute to the common good. For everyone, male and female, young, old, Parthian and Roman, Jew and Samaritan, everyone has standing in the eyes of God, and everybody counts. No one goes unpicked. The second mistake that the disciples avoided on that day of Pentecost is this: not dreaming big enough and thereby not blessing the future, even when it is a future that they themselves would not see. A few years ago, I think I shared the story of Leland and Jane Stanford with you, but it's the perfect story to tell today. You may, of course, recognize the name of Leland Stanford. He was the governor of California 160 years ago. He is credited with keeping California in the Union during the Civil War, and he was one of the founders of the Central Pacific Railroad, which helped lay that first transcontinental railroad. He was extraordinarily wealthy. Think Bill Gates and Warren Buffett wealthy. And during the latter half of the 19th century had enormous influence of what happened all over the West Coast and all the way to Hawaii. He didn't start out that way. No, he started out as a small shopkeeper in this dirty little mining camp, gold mining camp, working 24 hours a day during the California gold rush. But his little store was successful, and he built on it. And he built to such a degree that he could then do all those other things because he became fabulously wealthy. But in the 1890s, tragedy struck. He and his wife, Jane's only child, a son, died at the age of 16 years old. Full of grief, but wanting to suitably honor and memorialize and remember their son, they decided to give a gift that would be a fitting memorial to his life. Mrs. Stanford had been a longtime member and strong supporter of the disciples of Christ, and Mr. Stanford, who was always generous to every church that they visited when they would go around California, had this habit of putting two $20 gold pieces in the offering plate at every church they visited. That's the equivalent of about $800 today. So these two, who had so much wealth, and yet had taken from them that which was most important in their lives, went to the pastor of their church, where they were members. And they told the pastor they wanted to give a gift to the church, to the congregation, in honor and memory of their son. The pastor thanked them and thought long and hard, and then responded to them in this way: "That's very generous of you. Thank you. You know, the church parlor needs new carpet." The Stanfords thanked him and said, "We had something a little larger in mind." And they went and gave $10 million. $10 million. Remember, this is 1890s value. $10 million to found Stanford University. That poor pastor. Talk about a mistake not avoided. Talk about dreaming far, far too tiny. Talk about a failure of imagination and a failure to help folks honor the past by blessing the future. The pastor's failure here was indeed his inability to dream big enough, to imaginatively and even audaciously listen to what the Spirit was trying to do. His failure was in not realizing that the Stanfords, even though they themselves would not live to see the fruits of their future, nonetheless wanted to bless that future. But Peter avoided this sort of terrible mistake on the day of Pentecost. Peter heard that mighty rush of the Spirit and had the audacity to dream big. It was a big dream, indeed, that saw the church and the gospel and the good news of Jesus Christ spread not just there to Jerusalem, but to the whole world. It was a big dream. Indeed, a big dream that would soon take the church into Europe and Africa and India, into England and Ireland, and all the way eventually in the latter part of the 1800s to the foot of Pikes Peak. And here's the point. Peter and the disciples on that day of Pentecost would never themselves live to see even a tiny fraction of all the places where the gospel would take hold, where lives would be changed, where the church would be planted. For on the day of Pentecost, they renounced any self-centered selfishness that would claim that they're here and now and they were more important than the future that God had in store for the church. No. By their response on that day, they said, we will bless the future growth of the gospel, even though we will see so very little of it ourselves. What dream in your life are you in danger of dreaming in too small a way? Is there something that you sense the Spirit calling you to do, to become, to change, that may even be a little scary? Is there something that's been gnawing at you? Is there something that you believe the Spirit is calling us to do here at the corner of Platte and Cascade, still in the shadow of Pikes Peak, all these years after our founding? Something that can continue to give life to our mission statement that says we will have a particular heart for at-risk children and youth? Well, then the counsel of the Pentecost story is for us to make sure as individuals and as a church that we are indeed always dreaming big enough, because it might indeed be a calamity otherwise.